Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our second GLO session today. This session is the session on inequality and poverty, and it's part of the handbook. And we'll have 6 presentations today. And these chapters are at different stages of development. Some of them have already been published. Some are being reviewed, and some are yet to be submitted. So we welcome any feedback, and each presentation will be about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes, around 5, depending on the presentation, a few minutes for questions and answers. And we'll start with the presentation by Gerlinde Verbist with co-authors. And it will be on inequality and climate change.
Okay.
Gerlinde,
Okay. Yes, I would like to share my, yes. Have to do share screen. Okay. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you online. I would have preferred to have it live, but maybe that's for another occasion. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present this work here. It's work in progress. We submitted a first version of the chapter a couple of days ago, so any comments are still very much welcome. This is joint work with Milena, Buchs, Team Goedeme, Desta Mebrato, Josefine, Vanhille, and we've all been collaborating on this topic. Oops, I have a problem with my, I don't manage to get my slide. Okay, now it's working. Okay, maybe the topic of inequality and climate change is for inequality scholars a new one, but it's increasingly recognized that the climate change emergency is really permeated with issues of justice and social inequality. So there's a whole literature of climate justice and energy justice emerging. And this is about all the different aspects that relate to inequality, to justice in the issue of climate, and very much related to it also of energy. So it looks at inequality of contributions, inequality of the impact of climate change, and it also looks at the way policies can deal with this climate change issue and what the distributive consequences are. In the literature on climate justice and energy justice, you find these 3 dimensions: distributional justice, recognition justice, and procedural justice. So distributional justice is about the various impacts of climate change. How is this distributed over the population? This is a topic we will focus most on in this chapter, but also recognition justice is important. So do all the people get recognized for the impact that they suffer from climate change? And also procedural justice, how do policies come about? To what extent are people involved there? It's also an important dimension there, which is at play in this topic. In the chapter, we look at 4 different dimensions of inequality and climate change. So we first look at vulnerability. So we will see that there's a lot of disproportionality in terms of vulnerability of the impacts of climate change. Then we look at the contribution, the responsibility, who basically caused the problem. And then we look at the capacity to mitigate or to adapt to climate change. And then we also will discuss some very important inequalities there. And finally, we look at the policies that are set up to deal either with mitigation or adaptation, and how this is also permeated by issues of inequality. I will be very brief because I only have 15 minutes on those 4 topics, so it will be a rough sketch, but I hope to give you already a flavor what the chapter is about and what is dealt with. So first, vulnerability to climate change impacts. With vulnerability, 3 factors are distinguished in the literature. On the one hand, exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, which already goes to the 3rd dimension that we discuss in this chapter. The first one is exposure. Who lives in which place? It's a very important determinant of the extent to which you are exposed to the impact of climate change. Sensitivity, if you are already in a precarious situation, then you are much more sensitive to the consequences of climate change than if you are not. And this then also relates to the adaptive capacity. Do you have the possibilities to adapt to this climate crisis that we are experiencing more and more? If you look at these three factors and then look at the way this is distributed over the population, then you see inequality across regions, worldwide inequality across countries, but also within countries. What I show here now in the presentation is only an indication of inequality across countries. So what you see here is what is called the Notre Dame Gain Index. So this was an initiative from Notre Dame University. And they try to calculate to what extent populations across the world are vulnerable for climate change. And then you see immediately countries in red, the redder, the more vulnerable you are located in specific areas across the globe. So you see the Sahara Belt, Sub-Sahara Africa, but also in South Asia, some countries which are particularly vulnerable for the causes, for the impacts of climate change. So you have higher risk of flooding, small islands, but also in South Asia. Look at the flooding now recently in Pakistan. High risk of crop failure. It's also more prominent in those countries, especially because they still depend on the agricultural sector. So these countries are most dependent on sectors that are most highly threatened by climate change. And also, if you look within those countries, you will find a high share of the population that is very vulnerable for the impact of climate change. Also within Europe, you can see differences there according to socioeconomic status in terms of vulnerability for climate change. So people that live in big cities, heat island effect, they're much more affected by heat waves caused by climate change than people who can live in more residential green areas. So then I move to the second dimension, differences in contributions to climate change. So the responsibility. So as you all know, climate change is caused by the fact that there are too much greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And who emitted those greenhouse gases? We see a lot of inequality there as well. On the one hand, between countries, on the other hand, within countries. I will show some brief examples. Lucas Chancel has also published some important papers on this topic together with Piketty in 2015, but a very recent paper has updated and refined this analysis. But what I show here is a graph from the Global Carbon Project, who also monitor the amount of carbon emitted by different countries. I show them here by continent. And if you look at the total amount of carbon emissions from fossil fuels by continent, then you see that has been quite an evolution over the past 16 years. So in terms of total emissions, you see that Asia is now taking the lead. Since the year 2000, they've had a strong increase in terms of fossil fuel emissions, whereas before Europe and North America were the most important emitters. This is total amounts of emissions. If you look at per capita emissions, then you see a different picture. Per capita, it is still North America and Australia that are the highest emitters. Also, the Middle East is among the high emitters per capita, and Europe is decreasing and takes still a high position, but the fourth one in this overall picture. And if you look at per capita in Asia, but especially Africa, still has relatively low levels of CO2 emissions per capita. Important to consider here is that these amounts are calculated on production-based emission accounting. But of course, you have a whole value chain, a whole supply chain before the product ends in the basket of the consumer. And actually, you can say it's much more correct to take consumption-based emission accounting. And so you see here the value chain, the supply chain of all the projects, raw material, supplier, manufacturer, distributor. These are often not located in the same country. So if you are a country that has higher consumption-based emissions than production-based emissions, you're a net importer of emissions. This is the case in most countries in Europe. And if you are a country like China that has a higher production-based emissions, then you are a net exporter. So basically you can say you attribute the emissions to the country where it's actually due, where the goods are consumed. And then you get a different perspective. Then inequality of emissions is much higher. This consumption-based approach is also often used for looking at inequality of emissions within countries. And here you see an example of a study with it for Belgium. It's not in the chapter, this graph, but I think it nicely shows how also greenhouse gas emissions per household have this social gradient with higher emissions for the top income decile than for the lower decile. If you look at expenditure deciles per capita, then the social gradient is even stronger. Then the third dimension is inequality in terms of opportunities and capacity to deal with the climate crisis. So what extent can people really do something about the causes? So to mitigate the underlying problem, reduce emissions, and to what extent are people also to adapt to the changing societies that we have now due to climate change? So to what extent are societies and people able to protect themselves from climate-related impacts? And if you look at these different processes, then you see indeed also that there are huge socio-economic and political inequalities, with the most vulnerable countries least ready to facilitate those necessary investments. Also within Europe, you see that the financially vulnerable have fewer options to protect themselves, for instance, from the impact of flooding. Also in North America, this has also been documented in studies that with the flooding that took place after Katrina, it were the most vulnerable people who were most severely hit. And so you see that there are more and more indications that increasing economic inequality is also associated with power inequality that makes it much more difficult to do something about the problem. So to take effective environmental and climate policies. And so in that sense, there's a call in the literature for strong participation, to have well-organized public deliberation in order to have policies that are not only effective in terms of mitigation or adaptation for climate change, are economically efficient, but also do something about the social inequality problem. And so in the last section of the chapter, we look at the distributional impact of policies. Basically, climate change policies have an impact on all spheres of our lives, if you look at it. We list here a set of policies that have a direct distributional impact, and then carbon pricing is one of the most prominent one and has received a lot of attention in the literature. And what you see, if you have a carbon tax or an emission trading system, in general, the outcomes of these carbon pricing systems are regressive, so fall much more heavily on the lower incomes than on the higher incomes. Roughly speaking, you find the same for subsidies for low carbon technologies, for instance, subsidies for electric cars or for solar panels. These are taken up much more by higher incomes than by lower incomes, and also here you find this high risk of regressivity. Public investment in low carbon infrastructure, then it depends on who uses this infrastructure. So for instance, if you look at bus infrastructure, then low income people make more use of it. But if you look at train infrastructure, then you see that there's an imbalance there that tends to be used more by high income people. So it really depends on who uses this public infrastructure. Then also there's a distributional impact of labor markets and capital markets. We don't go very much in detail into this in the chapter, but the fact that you will have a shift from brown sectors, so emitting sectors, polluting sectors, to more green sectors will have an impact on jobs, on wages, and will in that sense also generate a distributional impact. Depending on the types of jobs, it's difficult to say in advance what the distributive impact will be. The same applies for capital market. You will have a shift from brown capital, so polluting capital, to green capital, which will also in many ways impact on the distribution of people that hold capital income derived from these capital infrastructures, for instance. So this brings me then to the conclusion of our chapter. So we argue that climate change and climate change policies are very strongly interconnected with social inequality issues, and that this should be recognized and receive more prominence. You see already in literature papers of the OECD, IPCC, and so that it's increasingly recognized that it's not just a technical problem, climate change, but that it's really also very much a social problem. We have shown in the chapter that there is asymmetry in terms of responsibility. So roughly speaking, the rich are more responsible for the problem, whereas the poor are the ones that suffer most and also have the least capacity to adapt to it. So it's very important to be aware of this adverse distributive effects that mitigation and adaptation policies can have. And so to pay attention to these adverse distributive effects and try to minimize these adverse impacts and to compensate for it. There are some examples there. So at the international level, it's important to organize international solidarity mechanisms. In the chapter, we focus more at the national level because that's also where still most of the policies take place. And then it's important to compensate for these regressive effects of market-based instruments, like, for instance, carbon pricing, carbon tax, through a per capita tax rebate or more progressive tax benefit systems. It's important to set up more and more systems that target low-income households for energy efficiency and home installation schemes, and also to look at services such as infrastructure in public transport or subsidize green home energy tariffs. So to have more of these services that will also benefit the poor. And this was, I hope, within the time, my overview of our chapter. Thank you for your attention and looking forward to your comments.
Thank you. That was perfect. We have a few minutes now for any comments and questions. If you want to say anything, you can just unmute yourself or raise your hand. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? So very interesting and very important. And I think it's important to acknowledge that it has a social gradient, both the problems and of course also the responsibility, as you clearly stated. I wonder how you think about distributional fairness when it comes to intergenerational aspects of this. So you didn't really discuss that a lot. So of course there's this cross-country, cross-individuals sort of fairness issues, but also I would think the responsibility is clearly not the future generations, but how do you also think about the fairness of do you discuss that in the chapter, or if not, why, maybe?
Until now, we have not really discussed it. Maybe there's one sentence touching upon it, but we haven't taken it up because, well, we had to make a selection of issues. Sure. And the topic is so vast. I tried to show that as well, but basically everything that you do relates to climate change nowadays. And so we made a choice there, but maybe we should give it a bit more prominence because indeed it's hugely important. And you also see it with the increase in carbon emissions, who's most responsible. Indeed, it's not the young generations nowadays. It's not the young people who are really demanding more stronger climate policies. They're not responsible, but they will bear much more of the burden of it than the generations that are responsible. So it's really a very important issue.
I just wanted to let people know, I don't see everyone, so please either speak out or raise your hand with the little emoji. I have a question, Mita. Through your research of the literature, which policies have you found to be most effective in reducing emissions?
Well, there are what they call socio-ecological policies that really explicitly target both the ecological aim and the social aim. And in that sense, the basic infrastructure is a very important one, so that you set up good infrastructure in terms of transport, heating, collective systems of heating, etc. These are, you could say, the most win-win policies because they both target reduction of emissions, but also are most beneficial for low-income households. If you look at carbon taxes, for instance, there are studies that show that indeed compensations can be made using the proceeds, the revenue that is generated by carbon taxes for low income. So that's also quite a good measure for that perspective.
Thank you. And we'll take one last question from Caroline. Maybe at the end we'll have time for some more questions. Caroline?
Yes. Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting chapter. And I was wondering, it's also highly topical, and what I always wonder, like in the context of low-income households, you can have all these programs, but the problem is also that many low-income households have no control over their housing to a large extent because they don't own it, or because they're, so that's kind of one of the problems. I was wondering if you were planning to take that into account. It kind of requires a different approach also in terms of policies than just supporting them to get it done.
Yeah, there's another paper, it's Josefine who wrote it, Josefine, one of our co-authors, about the different tracks that you can use for the different groups. So you have low-income owners, but you also have then the tenants and private housing tenants, private market tenants and social housing tenants. So in that sense, for social housing, I think it's obvious that the ones who own social housing should do the job and make housing in such a way insulated that emissions reduce considerably. The private market tenants is really a tricky one. That's the most difficult one to deal with, indeed. And so it's a way of developing incentives there for the landlords that they insulate the house. But of course, the benefit is for the tenants. So that's a split incentive problem, which is a difficult one. But there are some small scale projects that work on that. And now the challenge is how to upscale them. Then indeed you can make a bigger effect there.
Okay, thank you very much, Gerlinde.
Okay.
So we'll move now to the next presentation by Marcin Wronski on inequality and public pension entitlements.
Okay. Do you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, thank you a lot. Hello, as Eva said, my name is Marcin Wronski. I am a lecturer at Warsaw School of Economics. Today, I would like to present the chapter on the impact of public pension entitlements on the wealth distribution. This chapter has been written together with Eva Sierminska. The topic of this chapter is connected to the topic of my PhD. Scholars who investigate the household wealth distribution usually focus only on the distribution of private wealth. Similarly, the concept of household wealth adopted by the OECD in the influential guidelines on the microstatistics on household wealth excludes entitlement in the public pension system, also known as social security wealth or public pension wealth. The main reason for this exclusion is the lack of internationally comparable data on entitlements in the public pension schemes. The second reason for the exclusion is the limited liquidity of public pension entitlements. However, since the publication of the guidelines, availability of the data on public pension entitlements increased significantly. Here we can see the estimates of the value of public pension entitlements published recently by the Eurostat. And as we see in this figure, the value of public pension entitlements of the population, including not only pensioners, but also working age population, varies between 70% in Iceland and nearly 400% of GDP in the Luxembourg. In the majority of countries in the European Union and European Economic Area, public pension schemes are responsible for the majority of pension entitlements. There are many reasons why including public pension entitlements in household wealth may be worthwhile. Firstly, for many people, the rights to pension are the most important assets. It has been noted by Atkinson 50 years ago. Moreover, pension entitlements matter for the accumulation of private wealth. There is a huge empirical literature on the substitution between private wealth and public pension wealth. Pension schemes differ across countries, therefore public pension entitlements may be important in the context of cross-country comparisons. Finally, because public pension schemes are usually progressive, public pension entitlements may lower wealth inequality. Scholars who investigate the impact of public pension entitlements on the wealth distribution usually estimate the distribution of augmented wealth defined as the sum of private wealth and public pension entitlements. Sometimes private pension entitlements, so savings in private pension schemes, are defined as the separate component of augmented wealth. Sometimes they are included into the private wealth. Of course, if we extend the concept of household wealth to include the value of public pension entitlements, important question emerges: why only public pension savings? Maybe we should include also the value of human capital and the value of social capital. By so far, the empirical literature, including the value of human capital or social capital to household wealth, is limited. However, significant empirical literature on the impact of public pension wealth on wealth inequality emerged in the recent years. To assess the impact of public pension schemes on the wealth distribution, we firstly have to estimate the value of public pension entitlements. The value of public pension entitlements is usually defined as actuarial discounted value of future cash flow of pension benefits. So scholars firstly have to estimate the expected value of pension benefits which will be collected in the given year. This expected value, of course, depends firstly on the value of pension benefits and then on the survival probability, so the expected mortality, then the future expected cash flow of pension benefits needs to be discounted. The basic concept is simple, but there are many difficult decisions to be taken. Firstly, we need mortality rates to estimate the value of public pension entitlements. The literature is based on uniform mortality forecasts, which provide different mortality rates for men and women, but do not differentiate the mortality by income or wealth. So the empirical literature overestimates the value of public pension entitlements of poor who will live shorter than on average, and underestimates the value of public pension entitlements of the rich. Indexation of pension benefits needs to be taken into account. Here, most scholars rely on simplifying assumption that the indexation of pension benefits equal inflation. This assumption is rather conservative because literature documents that in many cases we observe the over-indexation of pension benefits, so the real value of pension benefits increased faster than inflation. In all countries of the European Union, some form of widower's pension, also known as survivor's benefits, exists. So when pensioner dies, his or her partner may be entitled to survivor benefits connected with the pension. Survivor's benefits are taken into account in single country studies, but usually are not taken into account in the cross-country studies because the rules determining the value of survivors' benefits can be very complex. To discount the future cash flow, we need to decide what interest rate to use. Fortunately, in the recent years, most empirical papers provide also alternative estimates of the value of public pension entitlements based on different interest rates. And in my opinion, the most important decision is the choice of the reference population. Of course, as economists, we like measures covering the whole population. So not only pensioners, but also working age households. However, the data on the value of public pension entitlements of working age household is very limited. As far as I know, estimates covering the whole population are available only for the US, the UK, and Germany and Switzerland. In these cases, in some of these cases, scholars were able to use administrative data. We can ask in surveys on the value of public pension entitlements, but even insured, so those working age households do not know how much savings they have accumulated in the public pension system. The estimation of the value of public pension entitlements of the working age households is complicated by many nonlinearities in the rules determining the value of public pension benefits. For example, in European countries, usually some minimum pension exists. So households workers who did not accumulate enough public pension savings are entitled to minimum pension, but usually they need some work seniority, so the minimum years of work. And how should we treat workers who did not accumulate enough years of work to collect minimum pensions, but will accumulate this entitlement in the future. Moreover, as Borgman and Heidler showed, the public pension entitlements of the working age population are uncertain. They show that the pension reforms implemented in Germany lower the value of public pension entitlements of the working age population by 30 to 60%. And single country studies at least try to cover the whole population. Cross-country studies usually focus only on pensioners or people near the pension age. For the European countries, we have 2 cross-country studies based on the household finance and consumption survey data. Authors cover only pensioners because in the case of pensioners, we can estimate the value of public pension entitlements based on the data on the value of public pension benefits. So data availability is much better than in the context of working age household. However, partial coverage of the population may result in the overestimation of the equalizing power of public pension system. To assess the impact of public pension entitlements of wealth inequality, scholars compare the value of inequality metrics estimated for the augmented wealth distribution and private wealth distribution. Sometimes they also decompose the Gini index by factors. Before 2000, our knowledge on the impact of PPE on wealth inequality was limited to the US and the UK. Today, we have estimates for 25 different countries. In many cases, we have more than one estimate for a given country. And as I said before, recently, cross-country studies covering many economies have become available. Based on the cross-country research, we can compare the equalizing power of public pension schemes in different countries. Of course, the ranking of the countries to some extent depends on the measurement method, but based on the reduction in the Gini coefficient, we can say that the equalizing power of public pension schemes is strong in Austria, Germany, Estonia, Finland, France, Hungary, Latvia, Netherlands, and Poland. The equalizing impact is medium in Belgium, Croatia, Cyprus, Italy, and Portugal. And the equalizing impact of public pension schemes is lowest in Luxembourg, Slovenia, and Spain. As I said, the cross-country research mostly covers the European Union states. There is one very interesting paper comparing the impact in Germany and the US. And in the US, the equalizing impact of public pension system is weaker than in Germany, and it is weaker than in the majority of European countries. The literature has expanded significantly in the recent years. However, it still is relatively young and has some important limitation. The comparability of single country studies is limited because authors use different data sources and methods. On the other hand, however, cross-country studies are usually simplified. They only cover pensioners. The authors usually rely on some simplifications in the estimation of the value of PPE. For example, the survivor's benefit are not taken into account or are taken into account in the simplified way. The geographical scope of the literature is very limited. The literature covers mostly advanced economies. In the recent years, some estimate of the transition economies in the EU have been published, but we do not know anything on the impact of public pension schemes on wealth inequality in the rest of the world. And in the developed economies, it is pretty clear that public pension schemes lowers wealth inequality. However, in developing countries, where public pension schemes do not cover the whole population, they may be regressive. As I said before, mortality differentials are not taken into account.
But you have about 2 minutes. Okay,
clear. I'm coming to an end. And our chapter includes the review of the literature for period post 2000. I will not discuss each case here, but the case of the Germany is pretty interesting. As we may see, if the research covers only pensioners, the reduction of the Gini index is close to the 40%. If the estimates cover the whole population, the equalizing impact is much weaker, and it is slightly higher than 20%. So, in the conclusion, I would like to discuss some recommendations for the future research. The first will be the increase in the geographical scope of the investigation. Cross-country studies would benefit from more in-depth estimation of the value of PPE, and mortality differentials should be taken into account. Thank you for your attention. This is still a work in progress. All questions and comments are welcomed.
Thank you, Marcin. We're now open for any comments and questions. Please speak up or raise your hand. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so very interesting and also important, of course. I was wondering when you talked whether you think about inequality in life over the lifetime. I mean, in a cross-section of wealth distribution, there will be a lot of inequality that could differ across countries because you have different age wealth profile. And it's kind of, the question I think is kind of related also to what you do, because of course, a lot of what you think you accumulate of wealth could be because of uncertainties, and then countries have very different levels of uncertainties at different levels of the age profile. So the size of the welfare state in general, maybe not only public pensions, but more generally could matter for how the life cycle profile looks. But of course, if you look at the lifetime sort of differences, or sort of what you accumulate and you spend as a retiree, I don't know what kind of perspective you have on that, because of course, over the lifetime, you may just also consume out of your wealth accumulation, right? But I was just, so it's a very loose question, but I guess, how do you think about wealth inequality? Is it a cross-sectional thing only, or does it have this lifetime or time dimension to it?
Yes, you're right. Life cycle, of course, matters. It matters for the private wealth inequality, but it matters even more for the inequality of public pension entitlements, because the age is the major factor determining the value of public pension entitlements. Moreover, not only the demographic structure of the society and life cycle profiles matter for the cross-country comparison, but also pension age. So the value of public pension entitlements is strongly dependent on the retirement age. And these factors should be discussed. So thank you a lot for this question. And in cross-country comparisons, including public pension entitlements, it would be beneficial also to discuss the age structure of the society.
Okay, thank you, Nora.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much for the presentation. Very interesting. And in general, I also do think it's very important to take pensions into account when discussing wealth inequality across countries. However, although it's not necessarily marketable, right? And all that, so there are some issues that need to discuss it, but you addressed them as well. So given that wealth is already such a complicated measure, right? Because it includes the various assets and debts, and then pensions on top of that. And then you argued on one slide that some are even arguing for including human capital and social capital into this measurement. And I've never, I was just wondering in how far you address this in your chapter, and what you make out of these suggestions, because I have not yet properly been convinced that this would actually make sense to include this on top of that as well.
So in our chapter, we do not discuss pros and cons of including human capital and social capital. We only note that such proposals are available in the literature. Of course, in the case of human capital, the estimation is even harder. In my opinion, in the European Union, the human capital would not be so important important, but in the US we have a problem of young graduates who are heavily indebted because they have student debt, and in current perspective on wealth inequality, they have a lot of debt and they have zero assets. However, they accumulated some human capital and paid for it. So I do not think it is necessary to augment the wealth concept to include human capital and social capital, but I think it may be interesting exercise. And it is difficult to say whether it would be beneficial or not. I think we need many different perspectives to cover different dimensions of household wealth.
Okay, thank you, Marcin. Thank you for the questions. We'll now move to the next presentation on inequality and housing by Gerlinde and Nora. Who'll be presenting? Gerlinde, I think.
Yes, I will be presenting, but I cannot share. Yes, I can share it now. I was about to say I cannot share my screen, but I can. Okay, I guess you can see it.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay, here we go.
All right, thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. So the title of our chapter is Inequality and Housing, and it's co-authored with Nora Waitkus, who's also present today. And we both work at the sociology department at the University of Tilburg. Actually, our chapter was submitted in May already, if I remember correctly, and it's already been revised, but we still need to do some minor revisions, so any comment is, of course, welcome. The chapter is also quite large. I think we used the whole word count that was available, so I kind of focused on making a story that had a bit of an understandable flow, rather than I'm going to not discuss everything which is in the chapter today. So that is just, you could of course read it to discover what else is in there. So what's the aim of the chapter is basically, of course, to discuss recent developments in theory and research on housing and inequality. And as we both work in a sociology department, we also took a sociological rather than an economic perspective. And that means we are more interested, I guess, not so much in outcomes, but in processes of stratification. So what produces inequality. And we also kind of try to refer back to the concept of social stratification as it was defined already by Max Weber, who basically said, well, there's three related but independent dimensions of stratification. So class, which refers to the triangle, say, education, occupation, and income, but also power and social status. And the latter is more an issue of prestige or honor or some symbolic capital. And both of these dimensions have kind of an independent impact on life chances. So that's kind of a thread that runs throughout the chapter. And the aim of the chapter was also to integrate literatures that have been largely disjuncted, because yeah, there's a lot of quite evident changes in housing now, certainly in the last years, through the financial crisis, I guess, following on from that. So housing is increasingly addressed as a topic within different literatures, but many of these new developments have also been discussed already in the field of housing studies and urban studies since the 1990s. So basically what we also try to balance a bit is, well, what do these new literatures have to contribute on the one hand in terms of bringing new analytical frameworks, but also we think it's important to kind of point out that a number of debates are sort of reiterated in a different terminology, and it's sometimes also important to look back and to see how this has been discussed before. So maybe a little bit about the context of the growing interest in housing is, of course, I think as we all know, and we'll try to go through this rather quickly, since the deregulation of global capital since the 1990s, a lot of well, capital controls were released, interest rates were low, etc. So there's been a lot of credit available in the economy, which was looking, well, credit was looking for investments, let's say, which means that national mortgage markets, so housing finance in the first stage, and later also residential real estate itself has been sort of included in global capital. And basically what happened is that mortgages and houses became investment products. This set into motion a cycle of house price increases. So it was kind of a feedback cycle that was going on. So you have kind of the transition to a debt-driven regime of accumulation, which was based on partly speculative house price increases, which then led to the global financial crisis. This increased risks in the macroeconomy, but also at the level of households. There's sort of, there's a lot more differentiation between households in terms of debts that were taken on for housing, but also in terms of opportunities. Because of course, those who managed to enter the housing markets, they almost became rich while sleeping in some instances. So there's also this sort of increasing wealth stratification, which then brings us to issues of wealth and wealth distribution. So basically, the starting point of the chapter is that many of these new literatures kind of take housing prices as a starting point. So this is the graph from the book of Joshua and Collins I've taken here. So this graph is a very often used one. It's basically the idea that the house price to income ratio has increased significantly over time in a number of countries, particularly the Anglo-Saxon ones. But there's also other people who use as a starting point, you know, that house price inflation has risen much higher than general inflation. So basically a lot of this revolves around house prices. As I've indicated already, there's a number of issues here. For those who manage to get into the housing market, there's actually not a problem with affordability, at least if interest rates will not go up or will not go up too much in the near future, but there's unaffordability of access to home ownership. So that's definitely an issue that is covered in the literature. So as I already indicated, for those who manage to become homeowners or have access to property, housing wealth accumulation is increasingly something that is of importance. But I guess what people also kind of sometimes forget a bit is that these very general developments, they actually vary across housing provision systems. So these kind of aggregate graphs are not always reflective of all European countries, for instance. But on the other hand, we also see some surprising developments like the financialization of housing in social democratic countries, which also have specific explanations, which we then discuss in the chapter later on. So housing provision systems also matter. So we reviewed 3 literatures engaging with house prices, as I indicated, wealth distribution, inequality, and polarization. As housing wealth becomes increasingly relevant to people and their budgets and in their wealth in general, there's also mobilization around it. So there's kind of a literature which we called the new politics of housing, which goes back a bit to an old literature with the impact of home ownership, for instance, or levels of housing wealth on social policy preferences or on political behavior. And there's also increasingly the idea that housing classes, I guess, which is also an old idea. So the idea that it's actually housing starts to have maybe an independent effect on life chances apart from other indicators. So these are 3 things we pick up in recent literature. And we also kind of, when we discuss them, we refer back to old debates that were kind of have been done and dusted, but actually might do with some reconceptualization and could also benefit from input from these new literatures. If I think about the politics of housing, I may be thinking about the risks of home ownership, which are certainly different from the 1970s. And if you think about the old debate on housing classes, I think it's certainly true that maybe there's a stronger connection now compared to the 1970s again between housing and traditional social class. But maybe I think our assessment would probably be that housing does not determine class, but that class really can determine what people do with their resources and their knowledge and how they actually behave on the housing market, and that provides interesting avenues for further research. So next, what do housing studies contribute then? I think what we can learn from housing studies is that this focus on house prices and house price developments, this is actually only one indication of broader system changes in housing provision systems. I think underlying there's been much broader trends. Think, for instance, about financialization tendencies which do not only target ownership markets and mortgages, but also rental housing, for instance. And actually, if you look under the surface, there's also been a process of social sorting going on, which I will come back to in a minute. And we discussed this kind of contribution from housing studies in terms of broader system changes into separate sections. One focuses on tenure restructuring, and the other one we called or we labeled the restructuring of tenure power relationships. And I will come back to that in a minute, what I mean with that. First, if we look at tenure restructuring, I'm sorry for the Dutch, but it was kind of the nicest picture I could find. So basically what you see in terms of tenures is that if you look across European countries, for instance, that there's not only been a decline in social renting and an increase in private renting, so there's kind of this unexpected revival of the private rental sector, but also that different types of households are increasingly starting to live in different types of tenures. So high-income households, if you look at the Netherlands, for instance, in the last 15 years, are sorting into owning, while lower-income households are sorting into renting. But combined with increases in rent prices, this causes a huge issue of unaffordability, which is currently figured as an important topic in many policy reports. Unaffordability of access to home ownership is also a problem, not only for lower income households, but also for the younger generations. So these are the outsiders who find it difficult to pay for higher house prices, which has also spurred on kind of a new literature, which we don't discuss too much because that would take us even further. But there's a whole literature on support of parents for younger generations housing, what this means for intergenerational solidarity and family support. Moving on to restructuring of what we called tenure power relationships. If you look at within the segment of homeowners, there's been polarization going on. So not only between owners and renters, insiders and outsiders, but you also see within the ownership segment kind of more a stronger link between socioeconomic position and the amount of housing wealth that people can accumulate. What you also have is that with the increase in the private rental sector, it basically means that housing which was previously owned or previously social housing is converted into private rental housing. But that also means that, other people own this housing, right? So basically you have a wealth concentration which is going on, which means that housing-rich households, people looking for investments, for instance, rich pensioners or institutional investors, they have started to own more of the housing stock in which other people live. And that has implications for the interpretation of housing as a basic need, because sometimes these investors use financial strategies which are not necessarily aimed at the benefit of the renters. So another aspect maybe of this restructuring of tenure power relationship is the idea of late home ownership, which was put forward by Forrest and Hirayama a couple of years already, but they kind of said, well, home ownership societies are really transitioning in the sense that, well, first it was home ownership was kind of extended as a social project to the whole population. What we see now is that it becomes more and more out of reach of some. It concentrates in the hands of others, and we're basically going to a situation in their view where you have people who accumulate real estate and then others who actually have to dissipate their housing wealth, for instance, to put their children to university or things like that. So that is kind of the gist of that. Then we also thought about, you know, as I said before, Max Weber had these 3 dimensions, class, power, and status. So then we also developed a section on the idea of housing. Well, if there's changes in housing regimes and changes in housing wealth, then it might also be a case that housing can increasingly be seen as a positional good, so an indicator of status, of social status, which would lead to the enactment of specific middle class lifestyles and also specific strategies. Most of this literature perhaps is also linked to the rise in economic inequality. So if you have people, of course, who have if people at the top have increasingly more resources which they could spend on symbolic goods related to housing, then this would have consequences for people lower down the income distribution. And we kind of charted how this strive for social status through housing works via the size of housing, maybe the quality and the type of housing, or a number of locational advantages. And what you kind of collect from this literature is that in this positional arms races, there's changes throughout, but the higher income groups kind of make the largest profits. It has as a consequence that overall housing inequality tends to rise, but particularly for those at the lower end of the income distribution, it could, for instance, have detrimental effects in the sense that they take on too much debt, for instance, or they get sorted into certain locations. So as a conclusion, I'm not going to repeat the structure of the chapter, but basically we also try to point out some avenues for future research. One of the things that also comes with changing housing markets is that house price developments have also become increasingly uneven. So we tend to look at house prices of countries, but actually within countries there's increasing differences between growing and shrinking regions for instance, and that's something that would have to be taken into account. There's also a literature we touch upon, which is kind of very recent, about the politics of housing regime change and how changes in housing policies might actually relate to changes in welfare states or issues of fiscal policy. So basically the links between developments in housing and other systems of regulation. And then with regard to the section on social status, another further avenue for research is also that all these aggregate changes obviously have consequences for households and individuals. But actually these, if you take all these individual reactions together, again, they might kind of be the root for further social changes. So yeah, thank you for listening, and we'll be welcoming your input.
Thank you a lot for interesting presentation. I have two questions. Firstly, do you address in some way the differences in housing between Western Europe and Eastern Europe? So in post-communist countries, over 80% of households own their main residence, and therefore increase in house prices are wealth equalizing, at least theoretically speaking. While in Western Europe, the share of homeowners is between 40 and 60%, as far as I know. So it is pretty important difference. And moreover, I have a general impression that you view the financialization of housing as something negative for inequality. I agree with you, but someone may say that, okay, if financialization of housing increases prices and make home ownership more difficult, but on the other hand, it may increase the supply of housing for rents. So if rich people buy new housing instead of investing in shares, the supply of housing increases and maybe rents are lower. So I agree that the financialization is bad for homeowners and those who want to buy a house, but poorest, so the lowest size of income distribution usually rents, so they may benefit from the financialization. Thank you a lot.
Yes, thank you. So with regard to Eastern Europe, yes, we do have like a basic description of different housing provision systems, and we also point this out because, yeah, that's also one of the things. I think the financialization literature is often very Anglo-Saxon, right? So that's one thing. So we kind of discuss how this varies across regions, and with regard to Eastern Europe, yeah, I think it's more like a lack of supply that basically would cause house price increases. So we have an indication of that, and also some references in the chapter. And with regard to your second question, there is actually also recent work that has shown that more available credit for housing has, over the long run, not been invested in increased supply, but has actually been used to yeah, it's a complicated argument, but it has basically been what has been available extra in credit has been used to compete for existing housing, which then makes it more expensive, which then is also good for investors because the more expensive it gets, you know, the more profit you can make from it. So there is kind of long run data that shows that more credit does not actually increase the supply of housing in general. Maybe of rental habits, yeah, that depends, of course. Then, if it would increase the price of rental housing, you also have to take into account regulation of the private rental sector, and that's then again an issue. So, but yeah, I agree with you that these it's a complicated. These things are really complicated, but we do have some references in the chapter to both of these things.
Okay, thank you.
A naive question, since I'm not an expert here in this field of housing and house prices. Now, given the global, if you look at it globally, yes, not from Europe or East and West and whatever, globally, well, the global trend is towards cities. So everybody moves to cities. Mm-hmm. What does this mean for rural areas? Is there no housing problems anymore, or are there particular housing problems because of this? How you would look at this?
Yes, that's a very good question. We didn't have a global perspective, but also in Europe, you see that that there's increasing increasing demand for city living. What would be? I think this is something that is a bit absent from the literature, actually. I think in maybe urban studies, there's more of this, but there are, for instance, it does matter, but I think what people analyze also is how increasingly low-income households are actually kept out of the city because they cannot access owning, but they cannot also access renting anymore in the cities because of all these other things going on in the background. Like with the type of rental housing that available is increasingly upgraded and not for low-income households. So these are again things which are discussed in recent literature, but we didn't include this specific aspect in the chapter as well, because we increasingly move to like, we already covered like a huge area, but to include urban studies and segregation, and in the chapter it's almost impossible to do this. But you're right that this is an issue.
I agree on the issue, but this is also a general remark. If there are deficits, I mean, you should only cover things which have been covered. Yes, the first thing. Yes, not rewrite or invent new parts of the literature. Write a research chapter. So that's perfectly fine. But maybe in the conclusions, one could have an outlook or have a half of a sentence of a few issues like this, yes, where people could maybe find interest to work in the future, and then cite your chapter, hopefully.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, we will do that.
There's actually, just to follow up quickly on that, there's actually some interesting studies on Germany showing the long-term development of housing markets, like regionally, how they differ by regions, and how price polarization is going to lead to more inequalities within Germany, with cities becoming ever more expensive, as Caroline just said, and rural areas, particularly in Eastern Germany, which have already been devalued much after reunification, are even going further down in terms of housing prices. So but this is all based more on projections than on current developments. But yeah, we could actually do something like that in the conclusion.
Yeah. Okay, we'll have to move on to the next chapter. Thank you very much, Nora and Gerlinde. The next chapter will be on inequality and microsimulations, and it'll be a presentation by the chapters by Denise Soligan, Karina Dorley, and Cathal Donahue. And will you be sharing the screen? Or?
Yeah, and I think Denise is going to share the slides.
Okay, great.
There you go. Denise, that's in it's on presentation view. Perfect. Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Cathal Donahue, and presenting this chapter. We have 15 minutes, so it's really just an overview of some of the concepts in the chapter on inequality and microsimulation with Denise Soligan and Karina Dorley. Next slide, please. So we've been asked to look at microsimulation and inequality. And in simple terms, microsimulation is a combination of two words: simulate, so the simulation of policy, economic and social changes on micro units, generally families or households, individuals or farms or firms. So we're looking at a subset of that today. It's been a growing literature, as we can see on the right, with about 6,000 papers a year now. It's a field that spans government and academia. There are a set of tools and technologies that government analysts use on a daily basis to assess policies in advance of them being rolled out. So I guess that's the purpose of the model, to improve design of public policy, assess the current situation, particularly in terms of the distribution of the population in advance of spending money on public policy. Next slide, please. It's a big field now. You can see from the number of papers per year, and so we don't present a survey of everything. These are two books: the Handbook, Microsimulation Modeling, that I edited maybe 7 or 8 years ago, and a more recent volume published last year with OUP that go into much more detail in terms of the methodologies used across the broad field of microsimulation. Next slide, please. The purpose of these modeling frameworks is essentially to try to understand complexity in relation to, I guess, these 4 dimensions mainly. The complexity of policy. So the models tend to try to replicate the detail that's in legislation. Models simplify from that detail, but that's probably the core focus of microsimulation models, that they mirror the legal description, and that enables you to look at how the specific aspects of policy impact on different people. So the population complexity is the second dimension, bringing in the distribution of the population. Now, the policies that are examined within microsimulation models have historically focused on tax and benefit policy, but in recent years, health policy is probably the fastest growing area. Environmental policy is important, education policy, pensions policy is probably often considered within tax and benefit policy. So the range of different areas that use these models is expanding. Very many of the models look at behavior, look at the impact of policy on the day of the reform, so in advance of a policy change. This is because when you've got complex policy and complex population, there's a lot of both interesting things and important things to work out. But there is a separate field that considers the response of behavior to policies, and very many policies have an explicit policy dimension. So whether they be incentives to rejoin the labour market or incentives in terms of the environment. And then the 4th dimension is time. Many analyses look at one point in time, but there are many policies that have a longitudinal dimension, like pensions policy, for example. So I guess the aim is therefore to deal with complexity. Next slide, please. We zoom in on one element of all of this multidimensional complexity, and we take as our frame the income generating process. So the factors that influence disposable incomes. So our study looks at understanding inequality through the use of microsimulation models. So on the right here is it's an equation. I won't go through it in that much detail, but in general terms, what it comprises of is a series of different income sources, J, where I is the presence and Y is the level of that income. Then there's unearned income, YU, B are benefits, and T are taxes. This is the formulation we have to describe microsimulation models in general terms across the number of people in the household, and then that YH household income. You can calculate inequality and decompose inequality into individual drivers. Next slide, please. Much of the literature and much of the analysis that's used in government are static tax benefit models. So they're models that focus on the interaction between the complexity of policy and the complexity of the population. They tend to take the market income dimension as given. Maybe there are wage rates might be updated or price changes might happen. There may be some reweighting of the population to account for population changes. But in general, that market dimension is taken as exogenous, and the interest is in understanding the way in which the design of tax and benefits impact upon the income distribution, and not just the existing tax and benefits, but critically changes in policy. Because the models are ex-ante and analytical tools to help the design of public policy. Next slide, please. In a dynamic microsimulation model, we add in T, because dynamic models are interested in what happens over time. And also because things change over time, demography changes over time, labor market characteristics change over time, and we're interested in longitudinal characteristics over time. And those models tend to elaborate the market element of the income generation model in more detail. And so they'll incorporate equations associated with labor force participation, wage rates, labor market characteristics like occupation, industry, and so on. So they tend to have a richer description of the labor market. Next slide, please. In mechanical terms, this is what a model, a particularly dynamic model, which is probably the most elaborate of the models. They take a base data set. They have a simulation engine because there's often large samples doing a lot of operations. There's a lot of engineering behind it, with a demographic model, particularly if you're looking over time, marriage markets, to looking at family formation and household formation. And then within the labor market module, we might have other data for estimating equations, extracting parameters, simulating. But a critical aspect of dynamic microsimulation models that's used in most of the mainstream literature is calibration. Because typically, dynamic models use exogenous projections from macro models or other projections in relation to demographic and economic characteristics that could be linked to macro models. Often you're projecting quite far off into the future, and so essentially, we wouldn't really trust the long-term simulation properties of a labor market. We prefer to use other models for that. And then there are policy models and analytical tools to look at things in various dimensions. So next slide, please. In the analysis we're going to present later on, Denise is going to speak just after me. We take that framework, that income generating model framework, to understand the components of various changes. And we do this essentially by, if we're looking, let's say, with two comparative dimensions, either comparing across countries or comparing the situation over time in terms of changes in equality. And we want to look at how much do individual components of this income generation model, how much do they contribute to changes in inequality over time or between countries. So we use our model to generate counterfactual incomes. What would happen if you had demography from a particular period with a labor market structure from another period, or a wage generating, an income function or return to education or labor market characteristics from another period, or indeed public policy from another period, and we swap the different dimensions of the system to try to understand which aspects of these things, which are all changing, influence the overall change in inequality. and indeed across countries, it can be a useful tool to understand which policies work well or which institutions work well when comparing across countries. Next slide, I think would probably, and then lastly is nowcasting. We're in a current crisis. We seem to have been in a number of crises over the last 10 years, where the financial crisis, COVID crisis, the cost of living. And for these models, we often don't have microdata at the time of the crisis. And so we use a modeling framework like a dynamic simulation model, but without considering the longitudinal aspect. But we do take the calibration element, where we calibrate our surveys to external control totals that are often available in mid-crisis. So we use this to generate a plausible income distribution reflecting the current situation in a crisis. I think it's over to you now, Denisa.
Denisa, you have about 3 minutes.
Yes. So we're going to continue with a few selected results included in the chapter. We start with the income generation model, which was developed with the purpose of decomposing the cross-national differences in household disposable income inequality into the factors, just the tax benefit systems, demographic, labor market factors, and returns. This approach incorporates the latest development in microsimulation and income decomposition techniques and builds upon several notable contributions. So we note here the Bourguignon, Frere, and Leite approach, which looked at decomposing market income inequality into its components. The Bargan and Callan approach, which looked at the role of tax benefit systems in understanding the changes in inequality over time. And the Dinardo, Foote, and Lemieux approach, which was a semi-parametric approach, we applied the reweighting techniques to tease out the role of various factors, demographics, in understanding changes in inequality over time. So in essence, this approach relies, as Carl said, into a parametric IGM for market income coupled with the tax benefit simulator, in this case it is Euromod, and the semi-parametric demographic adjustment. So the approach relies on generating a counterfactual distribution of household disposable income that would prevail in one country if these factors were swapped between countries. Here we have the example of decomposing the difference in disposable income inequality between Ireland and in the UK. But the black line shows the observed difference in the quantile function of the two distribution of household disposable income. And the blue line captures the tax benefit effect net of market income differences. So applying the Irish tax benefit rules into the UK distribution leads to a counterfactual difference to the UK distribution is very close to the observed difference. This difference is very close for the second half of the distribution and less so for the bottom half, which shows that there are more market income differences explaining the change inequality for the first half. So basically the blue line is the policy effect net of market income difference, which can be obtained with this kind of an infrastructure. It isolates the role of one factor, holding everything else constant. Similar transformations can be done for the returns, labor market, and demographic. Just to give you an example, importing the system of returns from Ireland into the UK, a drop in incomes at the bottom of the income distribution, and an increase at the top. This is the green line. So overall, the differences in returns between Ireland and the UK have a disequalizing effect, similar for labor market and demographic. So every composition is done via counterfactual distributions. The same can be applied over time. So we've done a similar decomposition in understanding the change in inequality in Lithuania between 2007 and 2015. So the bottom gains much less than the top. So there's an overall increase in inequality, which can be decomposed into the corresponding factors: demographic, labor market, price, and tax benefit effect. In the case of Lithuania, the change in returns are the main drivers of inequality over time, because the returns increase disposable incomes much more at the top than at the bottom. Similar decomposition can be done across groups. So here we have the blue dots show the gender gap in disposable income, and the orange line shows the gender gap in market income. So basically, the difference shows how much the tax system redistributes between men and women to reduce the gender income gap. So I will close here, and here we have a nowcasting exercise. It just show how using nowcasting can obtain basically distribution into the future using the latest survey data and recent macro statistics. So I will close with a summary conclusion. So the primary added value of microsimulation model is their capacity to simulate counterfactual incomes, which allows to understand the functioning of different market and policy income sources and the contribution of personal characteristics. And in particular, it allows us to understand the interaction between these factors. Most of the microsimulation literature focused on drivers over time, and that was stimulated by the economic crisis. Significant steps have been done to understand the income that is between countries, but only if you study statistics, and much can be learned from this. So exploring the institutional differences between countries can help understand a bit more what drives inequality between countries. Tapping into the macro-micro literature using CGE models can prepare counterfactual macro environments and use the micro models to track the asymmetric shocks such as the COVID crisis and its distributional impact on inequality. Last but not least, the renewed price inflation focus shows that adjusting income to account for non-discretionary expenditures and using expenditure itself as a welfare measure is a promising venue of research. Thank you.
Thanks, Elisa.
Thank you. We have time for about one question. Is there anyone? Yeah, I have a question. Actually, thinking about wealth inequality, I was wondering what you could say about micro simulation and wealth inequality. How have you thought about that for the future?
I can try and answer that. There are some studies, particularly some of the longitudinal analysis, that have looked at wealth by looking at the accumulation of wealth from income sources, so the flows in and out of wealth over time. Most of the analysis are income focused, so it's probably not a major focus of the current literature in microsimulation. Some of where wealth taxes are important, wealth taxes are often considered, but with wealth being exogenous in models rather than endogenous. But potentially interesting, I'd say.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation and your chapter. And now we'll move on to the fifth chapter, Understanding Inequality Within Households, by Ingvild, Charlotte Lingdal, and Ingrid Sjursen. And Ingvild, will you be presenting?
I will. Sorry. Now I'm just trying to. Okay. Let's see if this works. Can you see my presentation now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so thank you to Klaus and thank you to Eva for inviting me to write this chapter with my co-authors Charlotte and Ingrid. We wrote a chapter on inequality within households because we think it's important in order to understand inequalities in general, in order to measure inequality and poverty in a way that captures inequalities even within households, and because we think it's important for the policy questions related to welfare schemes. So let me first describe the chapter in broad terms. So it has sort of three parts. One is a descriptive part where we try to describe the economic inequality in a given society. Well, sorry, in order to first, so to describe and understand the economic inequality in a given society, this is what I said, it's necessary to understand the intra-household inequality. And in the chapter, we have first this descriptive part where we give an overview of within household distributions where we have data on it or estimations on it, okay? So, of course, what we could try to do is to elicit inequalities within households from consumption surveys. We could do direct elicitation, trying to ask who is consuming what. And of course, there are some challenges, I'll get to that, but at least we could try to directly elicit the allocations within households. Then, of course, a much bigger part of the literature, we try to estimate such shares within households. Of course, the caveats there are different than the direct elicitation caveats. And of course, they relate to the assumptions that we have to make when estimating this structurally. But these are the two sort of sources we have of within household distributions. And then there's, I should just mention, because it's a new literature that I'm also active in, and my co-authors are also active in, is also trying to elicit this in more experimental ways. So with smaller experimental studies, but this is not something we cover in the chapter because it's so new. What these facts show is that there are substantial inequalities within households in some contexts, not in all contexts, but in some countries, in some contexts, there are. And often, not always, but often it disfavors women and children. So it's often the case when you look at direct shares or structurally estimated shares that men would have more than women, and also children would have less than adults in the house. Okay, so what does this mean? That's the second part. So what does this mean for inequality and poverty measures? So for the standard poverty and inequality measures, we use either per capita income or some equivalent scale to find individual level, say, consumption, if that's what we're after. But of course, since we know that there is not always equal distribution within households, this will lead to biased estimates of inequality and even poverty. Because some households that are not considered poor, on average, using these equivalent scales or the per adult shares, there could still be poor people within those households, right? So we could underestimate poverty and also underestimate inequality because we do not take into account the inequality within households. Okay, so then, of course, the alternative methods would be those I already mentioned. So use the distributions from direct elicitations or structurally estimated shares to find inequalities within household and take this explicitly into account before we find poverty rates or inequality for a society. So then the third part of the chapter discusses policy or first the main determinants of decision-making within households, which again would determine shares within households. So key drivers, but also policy. So how should we form policies, and in particular, should we target women in transfer schemes? So that's sort of what we zoom in on. And we cannot discuss all kinds of policies, but we zoom in on this one policy that is targeting women with transfer. So of course, we know that many welfare programs in the richer part of the world would target women. So one example is just a Norwegian child allowance that would automatically go to the mother and not to the father. But also a lot of the programs geared towards developing countries, either from the government in the developing countries or from international or national donors, would target women. And then the question is, how does that affect this intra-household inequality that I mentioned? Okay. So then that's the three parts, sort of the overview part. So let me then go a little bit more into detail. So for the direct elicitation, you can ask in survey questions how goods are allocated. Of course, some goods are easy. So clothing, for example, is quite easy to know who is getting what within the house. For food, it's a little bit more complicated, but at least in theory, it should be possible because there is only one person who eats a certain food item. But then, of course, the public goods, like housing, it's very hard to think about even a split within the household. So there's sort of different level of difficulty in getting good questions to getting good answers to these survey questions. But for public goods, we can think of at least two naive ways of incorporating distributions of public goods. One is to split public goods in the same way as the private goods, So for the private goods, we can elicit it directly in the shares, and then maybe you can use those same shares for the other, thinking that is sort of a decision-making power that determines these shares, and then the shares of the public good is probably the same as the share of the private goods. The other method, which is maybe more sort of squares more with standard models of economic decision-making, is to split the public goods equally. So we just, in a very descriptive way in the chapter, we say, how would it look with these two different methods? So this is just, we don't have a lot of studies, I already said that would do this. This is the ones that we found that could fit easily into this that we wanted to do. Now we are also trying to collect like an overview of this for a web page. So please let us know if there are other studies we should include here. But this is the overview we have in the chapter for those that direct elicit distributions within households. So this is one survey from Bangladesh, one from Denmark, two from the Netherlands, and then one from Japan. And what do we see here? We see that if you use that method one then, which would use the shares that you can find for private goods, also for the public goods, you find that men would have more than women, and whether this is small or large, you can decide yourself, but 44 versus 56, if you just look at the adult share of the consumption. In Denmark, you see that it's actually disfavoring men for both of these methods, but I mean, not to a lower extent than this favoring of women in the Bangladesh study. And in the Netherlands, you actually see a bit of the same. So you see that women, and some people have argued that this is the way women are compensated because they may not have as much sort of freedom and active involvement in the labor market. So one way to compensate women for staying at home and doing a lot of the household chores would be to actually compensate in terms of consumption. But then, of course, when you go to Japan, it's very different again. So you see this favors women, and to a much larger extent than the other countries' differences. But then if you divide public goods just like equal shares, this difference is much smaller again. So it depends on the method, and particularly for Japan. Okay, so then to the structural estimation. So the collective model, much used. It's just taking these Pareto weights or shares and looking at the household as a weighted, so the household utility function as a weighted sum of the utility function for the wife and for the husband. And then you have some budget constraint. Of course, you can extend this to also have time use and a time constraint here. And we do that in the chapter. I will not spend time on that now. Okay, so what do we find? I will actually show two tables here. So this is the literature, again, that gave clear shares, right? There are many structural estimations of the collective model, obviously, but this is an overview of those who give very sort of clear shares in what they do. And then you see again that it really differs how you, so whether the man or the woman would be disfavored differs by demographics. And here we also include children in the overview. And I won't go through all these numbers in detail, but you see we have evidence from France, Cote d'Ivoire, Spain, UK, Bangladesh, India, Mexico, Bangladesh, Malawi, Albania, Bangladesh again, Bulgaria, Iraq, Malawi, and Mexico. So we have quite a bit of evidence, and it's sort of just a review of that evidence. And it's summarized in the way I said before, that in some countries, men are disfavored, but to a large extent, we see that women are disfavored, if any bodies. Okay. So what kind of implications would this have? So this is, of course, very aggregate average numbers. So when you want to look at implications for poverty and inequality measurement, you need to actually have individual specific or household specific shares, right? Not only the average shares. So LISER sets, they do this for the UK, and they look at consumption inequality, and they say it's underestimated by 50% in their study, which is a lot, obviously, because you don't take into account the within household inequality. But they also say that between household inequality increased a lot in the period between 1970 and 2000, well known, I would say, for the UK in this period, but that within household inequality decreased in the same period. And then they say, if we took this into account, overall inequality would stay relatively constant. So this is actually quite striking. So you could think about Thatcher and all the discussion about the increase of inequality in this period. And these authors at least say, based on their structural assumptions, obviously, but these authors claim that if you take account of this within household inequality, actually, it seems rather stable inequality in this period. Then you could look at, and I won't give an exhaustive summary here, it's in the chapter, but I can give one example where it matters for poverty measures. So in Senegal, 14% of households that is classified as non-poor include poor households. When you start looking at whether each household would have a poor person or not, 14% of those classified as non-poor would have a poor person. And then this is just an example, but you see that it matters, and it matters for quite a few of these countries where you can do this exercise. Okay, so then I will not talk a lot about the drivers. It's in the chapter, but it's interesting to see that in the literature, the drivers of these shares within households would typically be from the societies. It could be divorce laws, it could be outside options, it could be other laws that would generate these inequalities in decision-making or power within the household setting, which again then would determine the shares. But it's also a lot of individual characteristics that people discuss. And in particular, maybe the most used one as a driver when you try to identify this structurally is the share of the income that you bring to the table. So if the woman increases her share of income for the household, she would also increase her consumption share, according to these estimations. Okay, so then to the cash transfer. So I said one active policies across the world actually would be to target women. So it's discussed everywhere and it's used many places. And two main arguments are used. So one is the empowerment argument, that if you target women, it's good for women. And again, related to what we show in the chapter, of course, that could be equalizing because women tend to be, on average at least, the disfavored group. So maybe if you take Norway as an example, it was very important when we introduced the child allowance to target women because they worked less, they had less power in decision-making, they had less of the consumption in the household. Now, of course, we have a very high participation of women in the labor force. It may look very different. It may actually not be equalizing to target one group and not target another group, right? So now I think the discussion may be a bit different in Norway. But I think in general, when you look at the evidence from poor countries at least, there is this empowerment argument that holds empirically. So when you target women, they also get more say in the household decision making and also more resources. Yeah, I'll be quick. So then the other argument is the maternal argument, which says that you should target women because it's good for children and it's also good for the family. So women would prioritize the children, whereas men would drink at the pub, right? That's the anecdote you hear. However, the evidence of this is very mixed, and it's not very, you cannot look at the literature and just say robustly this holds up, because it does not. So there is a lot more research needed for this to study whether this argument holds. For this, it's maybe more consensus that actually you empower women by targeting them, which is less controversial. Okay, so the summary is that the chapter would look at first how you share resources between adults and how that matters for inequality, in particular consumption inequality measurement. The second is that we discuss if you transfer to a woman or transfer to a man, what happens to this inequality, first of all, but also what happens to other people in the household, like the children. Okay, so here's the chapter. Please read it and please send comments if you have any. It's been very interesting to work on this chapter, for us at least. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingvild. Just to mention that this is a live chapter, so we're able to update them over time. So any comments are welcome. Yes, Klaus?
Yes, this is of course a very important topic. It's also very, very, very complex, and it might be a lot of measurement and conceptual issues. Now, I mean, when you want to know about the share, who is what, then certainly the survey issue is an easy one because conceptually, because people can tell you, yes, I have so much share. But when you go down and measure, I would argue that lots of problems because can divide, and lots of what families do internally is about joint consumption, or what Becker would have called joint production, and then it's more difficult to find out where the difference are. So they are family goods, yes, and how can you share these things? Or when it comes to decision making, well, okay, you can count how many decisions is A or is B doing, but then there's an issue of aggregation. So what are the relevant decisions? Yes, a woman can make all decisions 99%, but the 1% very important one is done by the man, and so he at the end is dominating what's happening in the family. How is this covered in the literature? I'm a household production fan since for long, but I haven't followed recent literature on this sharing issues.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of what I presented here for the structural estimations would be based on the collective model, right? And there you have one sharing rule, so it's one-dimensional, right? So you simplify the problem by saying there is one scalar that picks up who is making decisions, and it's not multidimensional. And the strength of that, of course, is that you can estimate it. Now you pointed to the weakness of that, which is that it may be very different dimensions, and this may be different for different households, and maybe that's not captured in this scalar measure. I also think that what we are concerned with, which is the justification for not discussing this as a multidimensional thing, is that we're interested in the end, the consumption allocation, most part of the chapter at least, and then we also open up for this resource shares, which also includes time use. But we sort of simplify also the problem by focusing on consumption, because then you could think that there is, maybe it's hard to identify it, but at least there is sort of one rule they use that ends up being it's at least one end product that we're after, which is one-dimensional, which is the share of consumption. So so that's sort of a short answer. The other answer, of course, if you go in and measure it directly, then you avoid that whole problem, right? Because then you need not go through the decision-making process in the household. You can just measure the outcomes directly for individuals, not households.
Yeah, well, it's clear that you have a limited space anyway, and you have to focus. As long as you make clear in the chapter what you are focusing on, and you're focusing on literature, yes, which is there. So that's perfectly fine. So, but one should not avoid somewhere reflecting the general problem.
Yeah, but if I can say something related to what you say that I find both interesting and puzzling, and point to the fact that we need more research on this, is that if you look at these decision-making questions that has been used in the DHS service, for example, so who is deciding on what to cook, when to cook, who is deciding on, there's a whole list. And it picks up, I think, what you alluded to, like the different dimension of decision-making. If you take these and you create an index, or you take a single one of them, or you use them in different ways, they often do not predict any change in household decision-making. So if you have a program that changes, often these measures would not predict any change, Whereas if you look at the consumption allocation, it shifts. So say for the Colombia study, for example, like Progresa in Mexico, but also other studies, if you look at sort of a change when you target women instead of men, and you try to measure whether that changes her decision-making in the household, these measures wouldn't pick up any change. But if you look at consumption choices by the household, it changes. So something happens. So I think also the ways we have tried to measure.
We'll have to stop because we have one more speaker.
Yeah, okay. So, but the way we've tried to measure these things would have their issues. That's the short answer. So I think trying to estimate like one sharing rule instead through these collective models may have advantages over that. But then, of course, we should also look for other direct elicitations as we sort of also push for in this chapter. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. And our sixth presentation will be on inequality at top incomes and by Charlotte Bartels and Daniel Waldentrum, and Charlotte will present.
Quick to not run out of time. I think the session is over in 15 minutes, isn't it, Eva?
Yes. So
okay,
do 14 and a half and we'll have time for one question.
Okay, I'll be quick. So this is a chapter on inequality and top incomes together with Daniel Waldenström. We've both worked extensively on top incomes, particularly in our own countries. So Daniel has produced long-run top income series for Sweden and I for Germany. So we summarize in this chapter the several aspects of this literature. So first of all, to start with, the top income literature emerged from the ambition to study the long-run evolution of inequality, also the path of development. So first of all, Kuznets started to work with tabulated tax statistics to compute income concentration at the very top, which was then rediscovered in the 90s and most famously further developed and put onto developed into broad research agenda by Piketty in the early 2000s. So the nice feature about income tax statistics is that they often include distributional tables, and they were produced since the introduction of modern income taxation, which was in Germany in the end of the 19th century and in most other countries in the beginning of the 20th century. So this nature of data has given rise to the study of top incomes, because only top income earners were covered by income tax statistics, for which we have the data sources. So there exist already several surveys, but this survey introduces several new aspects. First of all, we provide an overview on the methods that have been developed to top correct incomes in surveys by either replacing or reweighting incomes. We introduced the new income concepts of pre-tax and post-national income that have been used in the DINA approach that has been developed at the Paris School of Economics. But we also, which is an approach to align survey income tax data and national accounts to make these top income measures on inequality measures even more comparable across countries. And we also compare the DINA approach from the Paris School of Economics with the European Commission and OECD approach, the DNA approach. Then finally, we provide most recent evidence on top incomes that has greatly expanded in geographical scopes, and we provide an overview on the determinants of top income. So first of all, after the introduction, we present the data sources, income definitions, and methods that are usually used to estimate top income shares. And we put a focus on the new top correction methods that have been developed in the past years that reweight or replace top incomes in household surveys. And then we make we also compare the most recent developments to align surveys, income tax data, and national accounts, the DINA and the EGDNA approach. And we provide a description of the main top income share trends around the world, contrasting methods and concepts. And we provide a survey of the literature in chapter 4, on section 4 on the determinants of top income shares, with a focus on studies that propose new methods to establish causal links between driving factors and top income shares. So as you might all know, the top income share literature mostly estimates top incomes using Pareto interpolation methods, and Pareto coefficients are obtained for all income brackets of distributional income tax statistics. So this is important to note. It's not implicitly assuming that there is a single Pareto distribution parameter, but rather flexibly varying across the income distribution, which has been shown using microdata to better capture the top of the income distribution. So then we contrast the concepts of income tax data and household survey and emphasize the different nature of undercoverage in both data sources. So income tax data are silent about the bottom of the income distribution that is not subject to income taxation, and household survey data are silent or often do not correctly represent the top of the income distribution. So what can we do to combine or to take advantage from both from the coverage of those data to tackle the undercoverage of the other data source? So some top correction approaches have been developed to correct for the undercoverage of top incomes in household surveys. One strand of literature is doing reweighting to correct for coverage error or unit non-response, and replacing tries to correct for top coding, trimming, censoring, or just underreporting unit or item non-response of top income earners. And we highlight that there are 3 decisions when one wants to replace top incomes in surveys. First of all, one has to decide what proportion of the survey income distribution should be replaced. Stephen Jenkins has a study on this and recommends to go either for top 5 or top 1% as a rule of thumb. Then one has to decide if one wants to draw on either within survey information or external information to estimate the parameters. I myself have a paper where we draw on income tax statistics as an external information, how top incomes are distributed in Germany or internationally, and Blanchet et al. Also have a similar paper where they also match top income tax statistics to fill in the top incomes in the survey data. And finally, one has to decide on a parametric distribution, how to generate these top incomes, and several papers also co-authored by Stephen Jenkins suggest to use the GB2 distribution, which outperforms the Sigma, Dalla, or Goedeme distribution they claim. So now finally, to bring together the advantages of survey data who cover the bottom of the income distribution, income tax data who cover the top of the distribution, and national accounts who follow an international standard of income concepts following the standard of national accounts defined by the UN. There are 2 approaches to combine the 3 data sources I just mentioned, the DINA approach and the EGDNA approach, and we do a very detailed comparison of the 2 approaches with its own highlighting the advantages and disadvantages of the 2. As we are contributing to the DINA approach, which also has developed more greatly in scope than the OECD European Commission approach. We compare long-run trends from the DINA project, and we first downloaded all the traditional top income shares, which was like the first generation of long-run top income shares being produced in the 2000s, and compare this with the DINA top income shares that are produced with this new method where income tax, survey, and national accounts are aligned. We highlight that these series that are online at Real World are very heterogeneous in quality. And I think this is also a nice aspect of our paper, that we make a snapshot of what is actually online and compare the different series visibly directly next to each other. Only the United States and France have DINA series that they're actually based on individual income tax returns. That allows the researchers to carefully align the very detailed differences between the data sources. And Germany, Netherlands, and Sweden have been in process for several years now, because this new approach, if one wants to have implemented very carefully, is very work intensive. Let's start with what we find online for the Anglo-Saxon countries. Traditionally and with the new concepts, it seems quite similar. What we obtained from as the share of income accruing to the top 1%, looking at the traditional pre-tax income definition from income tax tabulations, and looking at the pre-tax national income on the right-hand side from the DINA approach. Slightly lower levels of income concentration are documented and slightly more stable. But then we can also look at continental Europe or at Eastern Europe, which is new and only recently been filled. And it's interesting to see that there are much more DINA series available on the right-hand side. So this means that there are basically only survey data aligned with national accounts underlying this series on the right-hand side, whereas the series on the left-hand side are based on income tax statistics as well. And we see a sharp rise in income inequality during the 90s in these Eastern European countries. Nordic countries are also present at the World Inequality Database, and the Asian countries as well, and Latin American countries and African countries. And I just want to quickly highlight that these African countries are an example of how heterogeneous the DINA database still is, with this series of Senegal, Botswana looking very strange. So I think this might also push the researchers to do some checks of their data and call for careful use of this, of every single country series that is downloaded. So what can we learn from long-run trends from this major international research effort? First of all, we see two major breakpoints in rich countries that occur around the 40s, during the end of Second World War, and in the 80s. And there's a paper by my co-author Daniel Waldenström identifying 1943 and 1982 as a turning point. We get a different picture when we turn to former socialist republics or developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In general, we see higher levels of income concentration and less of an equalizing trend throughout the 20th century. But we should also add that the evidence is more scattered for those countries, and some series appear to be less credible than others. There is an upward trend in income concentration in the 90s in Eastern Europe, especially in Russia. So we relate this to the economic transition from a socialist country to a market economy. And because we also see an upward trend in China, Indonesia, and Taiwan since the 1980s. So as I said, there are DINA series based on income tax microdata available for United States and France that we can use to analyze the impact of taxation and transfer schemes on income concentration at the top. We see that post-tax top 1% income share is higher than pre-tax, sorry, it should be lower. And the difference between pre-tax and post-tax 1% share can give us a grasp about the redistribution going on. And given that this gap in both countries opened up, we can conclude from this as an indicator for declined redistribution in both of these countries over time. So in the final section of our chapter, we review the literature on determinants of top income shares and their trends, and we differentiate between finance, taxation, trade openness, institutions, generally speaking of deep-rooted institutional conditions, and wars. So we look at specific geopolitical shocks to the economic and political system. So we find that financial development and deregulation tends to increase top incomes, whereas taxation is more ambiguous. So the sign and the size of the correlation between top tax rates and top incomes seems to vary over time and over countries. Generally, there's a paper by my co-author Daniel Waldenström with Enrico Rubolino where they show that top tax elasticity seems to have increased since the 1980s and increased moving to the top of the distribution. The existing literature cannot find any clear relationship between trade openness and top incomes. Institutions like democracy seem to be related to lower top income shares. And wars like coming together with mass mobilization seem to be related to increasing tax progressivity. So in our conclusion, we call for further research along 5 different dimensions. First of all, it would be nice to see a synthesis of the reweighting and replacement methods to tell researchers how to combine or how to either use one method or the other. It would be great to have more evidence on post-tax and transfer incomes during the period of welfare state expansions, so that we could learn more about redistribution and top incomes and the role of the state. And it would be great to have more causal studies, as most of the studies that I just mentioned are still rather drawing on correlation than on causal settings. Maybe we have to revise our conclusions from the previous literature then. There's also very few studies investigating the mobility within and into top income groups, which might matter a great deal, as societies generally seem to agree on the fact that we want to have an equality of opportunity within careers and across generations, and this can maybe limit our or extend our acceptance for income inequality in a cross-section. Finally, there seems to be no consensus about consequences of income concentration, where more research is actually needed, what income concentration does to our economic systems, for economic growth, to political outcomes, health, crime, etc. And this will concern both academics and policymakers, given that income concentration has been on the rise in many of the countries, as I just showed you. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was perfect. Any questions? Yes. So I have a question regarding how you think the layest results would be if you were to complement your chapter on, let's say, the pandemic evolution of top incomes during the pandemic and maybe now during times of war, during high inflationary times. How would that additionally add to the chapter?
Yeah, I think it can extend the scope of this literature even further, right? Because we probably see an even further increase in income concentration and wealth concentration during the pandemic, because particularly top income earners save more, whereas the bottom of the distribution lost out. So I think it opened up more, also more relevance to study macroeconomic environments like inflation for these type of questions. Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this session. If I manage, I just wanted to share one more slide, but I'm not sure.
Sorry, I have to stop.
Oh, okay. Just here, how do I do this? Share screen. Just to show you this section that we have on where's this? On inequality and poverty. We have about 16 chapters now. So today we were only able to present to you about 6 of them, but there's many more either already published or in the process of being published. So just wanted to share that with you. And thank you all. And this session will be recorded, so you can also forward it to your co-authors or colleagues to have a look at our section. Thank you all, and hope to see you soon in person.